Welcome everyone to our webinar this afternoon, the Board President's Playbook, Strategies for Success. It's a pleasure to see everyone today, and I'm excited about this. We did a webinar last year. First time we developed a webinar specifically for board presidents, and it was a success. So I wanted to do that again today and share with you some resources, some ideas for all of those who are serving as board presidents. I like to say we can't have strong Episcopal schools without strong Episcopal school boards, and there's absolutely no way to have strong Episcopal school boards without really excellent, high-quality leadership in that president or chair's role. So first and foremost, thank you. You are in a multifaceted role. You're the lead dog of the sled team. You're a cheerleader. You are the captain of the tug-of-war team. You are the telephone operator trying to make sure to connect everybody, and you're the leader of the board. So we wanted to spend some time today really making sure that we identify the complexity of the role and also give you some thoughts for how to start the new year successfully. So another way to look at it is you are the captain of a great team. You are the leader of the board in your role as chair or president. And so we're going to look at some different plays that I would recommend you consider calling this year as you're leading the board. One comment briefly about the president versus the chair role. So I'm going to use that term interchangeably. If you're in the Diocese of Texas or in some dioceses that use a chair and president model, then some of the things we're going to talk about today will be divided between those two people. It's important that you're intentional about how that leadership is divided, but for the most of my schools, you have either a chair or a president. So I may use both of those terms interchangeably. Don't let that throw you. Ask any questions if you have some clarification, but some schools will have both a chair and a president of the board. And then the important thing is that you're very intentional about who's dividing up which responsibility. So let's take a look at some things. First, before we go any further, I would love to hear what burning questions you may have brought to the table today. We're not going to stop and answer all those right now, but I would love to get a feel for if there are any burning questions you have to make sure that we address those before we finish up today in about an hour. So, Mary Catherine, are there any questions coming through specifically on burning questions or burning ideas that people are wanting to bring and wanting to talk about?
Not yet, but we do have one that just popped up. Do you want to answer it right now?
Yeah, let's go ahead and talk about that a little bit before we dive in.
What are some ways to engage parents?
Okay, let's hold on to that. I think we will address that in the presentation, but if not, let's make sure to talk about that at the end. So parent engagement as well in the community.
Right.
Okay, if there's no other burning questions, I'm going to jump into the material. And again, we're going to have some time at the end to address that. So I'd love to talk a little bit about parent engagement. Let me start with a quote from Peter Drucker. And I think this is a great way to frame the leadership challenge of a board president. Leadership is lifting a person's vision to high heights, the raising of a person's performance to a higher standard, and the building of a personality beyond its normal limitations. That's what you're called to do in your leadership of the board. So 3 specific things I want to do today. Look at those key plays for the new year. Then I want to drill down into the president-head relationship. Finally, I want to look at 2 important questions that every board president needs to ask, especially if this is your first year. If you're a returning board president, you need to be aware of them as well. But if you're a brand new board president, I want to give you 2 critically important questions to ask. And then we'll use the balance of the time today for Q&A. So key plays to call. Let's look at 3 potential plays that I think are very important. Play number 1, cultivate a positive board culture. This is the most important thing, in my opinion, that you can do. 2 great quotes. Another Peter Drucker quote, culture eats strategy for breakfast. Doesn't matter how great your strategy is, doesn't matter how intentional you have everything mapped out. If you're not recognizing culture and setting a positive culture, the possibility for success is going to be minimized. And then finally, Lou Gerstner, culture isn't just one aspect of the game, it is the game. So I want to start by really drilling down to what we mean by creating a positive board culture. Hopefully, in your environment, if you're a new board president, you have inherited a really, really positive culture. If that's the case, that's awesome. But realize that didn't happen magically. You've inherited the hard, intentional work of the previous board president or the board chair. This is the biggest gift you can give to the school. And so I want to be very intentional about what's a positive board culture look like. Here are some things to consider. Positive boards demonstrate a healthy and respectful partnership between the board as the governing body and the head of school as the CEO. You also see trust and candor among board members. You see thoughtful and productive resolution of issues. And you also see a willingness to address poor board behavior. These are things that, in my opinion, only the board president can contribute to set the stage for this. So what I would recommend from a strategy perspective is keep an eye for these 5 warning signs. And if these warning signs are popping up, then pull back and talk about what can we do to create a more positive board culture that will promote some of those things I just mentioned earlier. So warning sign number 1 is if you've got cliques within your board. So if you're noticing that certain groups of people are always sitting together, always talking, always sidebarring when the rest of the board is having a conversation, anything that looks like a clique, not necessarily, go break that up immediately, but that could potentially be a warning sign that could erode trust among the entire membership. Another warning sign to look for: do you have the meeting after the meeting? This is a situation where there's the board meeting, everyone's relatively polite, but then after the meeting, the meeting happens, either in the parking lot or somewhere, for the meeting. That's not healthy, because that indicates that important conversations are not taking place within the context of the boardroom. That could be a trust issue, that could be who knows. But if you're sensing that the real conversations are happening outside of the board meeting space, then as a board president, that's something for you to reflect upon and ask, well, why aren't they having those conversations out in the open in front of everyone, or at least in an executive session? Individual board members dominating the discussion. One of the strategies is to be very intentional about monitoring microphone time. What I mean by that is it's not healthy if 2 or 3 people are the only ones talking at a board meeting. That can be a problem. If there's an overuse of the executive committee, what I mean by that is similar to the meeting after the meeting, if all of the decisions are pretty much made in executive committee, and then the board is used as a rubber stamp to endorse what the executive committee did, that can be a warning sign. Again, sometimes that happens. I'm not saying that that can never happen. Obviously, there are going to be some things that the executive committee is going to talk about and then bring to the full board. But if that is a consistent pattern, that can erode trust at the board level and can prevent the board from functioning fully. And then this last one is a new warning sign for me, but I think it's important to recognize sometimes there can be too much closeness between the head and the president. What do I mean by that? Sometimes if that relationship is so strong and so tight, other board members will actually be a little nervous about sharing a contrary opinion because they just know the board president is going to do whatever the head of school says and vice versa. So that respect piece, that relationship piece is critical, but just be aware that it is possible to go too far on that, too far over the norm and get into a period where just too much closeness between the head and the president. So something to think about. Again, none of these, if you're seeing these, that doesn't necessarily mean, oh my gosh, I'm doing a horrible job, the board's about to crumble and fall. No. But if you're seeing some of those warning signs, it's possible that some of the practices that are in place are going to prevent you from really being able to achieve some of those high-performing board elements that we talked about earlier. So what are some additional strategies you may want to consider? First, be very intentional about setting the agenda. So the board, when we get into the start of the year checklist, we're going to talk about this a little bit more. But the agenda of the board is not just a document that refers to what you're going to do at that month's meeting. What I mean by that is the agenda for the entire year. I mean, the entire year should be roughly mapped out so that you know what we're going to cover at each meeting. Obviously, we're going to cover the fiduciary pieces, the financial reports, various reports that you may need to hear either on a consent calendar or in person. But being very intentional about how do we want to use what precious time we have every time the board gets together. That needs to be set intentionally and then shared with the entire board so they understand what the roadmap looks like. Expectations. Are board member expectations documented and then reviewed? Now, what do I mean by that? If there is not a board covenant or a letter of understanding or a job description or some type of document that spells out, here's what we expect of our board members, then you may want to consider doing that. You can do it all sorts of different ways. But basically, take into consideration, we're going to come to all the meetings. We're going to come prepared. We're going to be involved in committee work. We're going to support the school financially. We're going to understand the difference between being a parent and being a board member. We're going to have a code of conduct. There's going to be certain expectations about how we're going to conduct discussions in the boardroom. All of those things. Have you talked about what we expect of our board members, and have you documented it? There's 3 particular times you want to pull that document out. First is the onboarding of new members. Second is at your annual retreat or whatever the start of the year meeting looks like. And then it's not a bad idea before difficult conversations to just set the stage by saying, okay, guys, just want to remind everyone about the code of conduct. I just want to remind the agreement that we have all signed off on in connection with how we're going to discuss difficult things. It makes it way easier to create that board culture if expectations are documented and reviewed. Then it's no longer just the board president by himself or herself asking of that, but it's a corporate act that we all have signed off on. And then finally, I mentioned managing the mic earlier and controlling airtime. Are you managing the clock as well? Are you making sure that not one personality or 2 people are definitely dominating the airtime? Are you making sure that things are staying, following the agenda and staying on time? That's the first point.
David, real quick question.
Yeah.
Somebody wanted to know about today's slide deck. We will be offering that up, opportunity for having a copy of the slide deck. Is that correct?
Correct. So what will happen is participants will receive an email link where they can watch this on demand, and they'll also get a copy of all the slides. Correct.
Okay. Good.
Okay, let's take a look at play number 2. Play number 2 is, are you as the board president keeping the board focused on the main thing? I love this David Reisman quote. Your responsibility is to protect the future from the present, okay? Forward thinking, future oriented, that should be your focus. This is especially a challenge. Most of my schools have board members that are populated by lots of current parents. That's not a problem, but it does mean that as a board president, you need to be very well versed in how do we keep the main thing. And when parents are around the board table functioning more in a parent role as opposed to a trustee role, what are some strategies that you can use to protect the future from the present? Make sure the conversations around the board are focusing on how does this affect the mission, how is it going to make us stronger in the future, as opposed to just problem solving the immediate issue that's being presented today. A couple of things to think about. If I've done board training for you in the past couple of years, then you're familiar with this slide. This is a slide that I use. It's out of the NAIS Trustee Handbook. And it basically tries to describe what I call the lanes. What belongs to the board, what belongs to the head and what is a shared responsibility. And we're not going to go through this in a ton of detail out of respect for time today, but basically as the board president, you need to understand that that top lane, that's the board's lane. So things relating to strategies, mission, nurturing the head of school, supporting the head of school, coordinating a leadership transition if that's the case, or any major items such as a capital campaign or a building project. Those are things that are in that top lane that we would call board decisions, but obviously a board, and especially a board president, is going to seek the head's counsel on those matters. The bottom lane is where if you end up in that lane as a board, you're not protecting the future of the school, and you're getting brought into operational issues, which are really the head of school's purview. So things like admissions, whether or not student A will be attending the school, staffing, hiring, assessment, counseling teachers out, anything relating to the program, curriculum, anything relating to those ideas or systems of the school. All of those are operational issues. The partnership lane is the middle lane where it gets a little bit tricky because that is an example of what's shared. So, for example, enrollment management is a shared decision. Enrollment management is differentiated from admissions in this way. Enrollment management talks about what's our capacity, what's the ideal student-teacher ratio, those kinds of things. Those are board head shared decisions, as opposed to should student A be admitted, what should the specific financial aid award be for family A. Those are admissions questions, which are more operational. So as the board president, it's critical that you understand this slide, and your job is always to make sure that the conversations are in the top lane or in the shared lane. And when you find yourself being pulled into the operational lane, you understand that's not this board's job. So we're going to refer that matter to the head of school and ask for a report next month, and we're going to go from there. So again, refrain from getting involved in operational matters. And then no one is better equipped to help board members in a lane violation than the board president. So it's very difficult for the head, for example, alone to be the police officer to make sure that the board is doing what they're supposed to be doing. That's your job as the board president. You've got to make sure that when a board member is really in the operational lane, you are correcting that and holding a mirror up to that and trying to say, you know what, I understand this is an important issue to you, but you need to visit with the head of school about that. That's an operational matter, and the head of school is the final decider on all operational matters. The board does not get involved in those things. No one else can do that but the board president, and it won't be done if the board president isn't doing that. Play number 3. Keep the board in good running order. Ian Craig is a head of school. Here's his perspective. Board chairs do not always understand the intricacies of how schools run. It's not their role. They do, however, need to understand what leadership looks like and how to be supported. So what does it mean to keep the board in good running order? Here's a checklist for you to have in your back pocket. Number 1, boards that are in good functioning order are intentional about onboarding of new trustees and also annual board development. So what's your process for when you've elected a new board member? Do you have a session just with new board members? Do you dedicate some time to this at the start of your first board meeting to kind of onboard them? Onboarding is one of the biggest indicators for high-performing boards. Or is it a matter of you just expect them to fold in, maybe you give them a binder or a packet of information, and you just expect them to read up and hope that they can get plugged in? Coming onto a board is very similar to walking into a movie halfway through. There's a whole bunch of characters that you may or may not know. There's several storylines that are unfolding. You may or may not be aware of that. And it's your job as the board president to get those new board members up to speed. The second item for keeping the board in good running order is setting goals for the year. Now, we're pretty intentional about setting goals for the head of school. I get lots of emails about that. But are you setting goals for the board? Does the board have 2 or 3 high-level goals that it wants to accomplish this year? And then are those goals informing the goals of the committee? Again, depending on your committee structure, it doesn't need to be that complicated, but there should be a document where you have the 2 or 3 goals for the board. And then how does that trickle down to the committee? So, for example, if one of the goals of the board is to increase alternative streams of revenue, then that may be a focus area for the finance committee to explore, expanding the summer program, or ask the head of school to develop a program to expand after school care, or explore, whether or not there could be facility space that could be leased out, whatever. But that's an example of a high-level board goal, increase alternative streams of revenue, and how that trickles down to a committee goal, explore, whether or not we could lease the Smith Activity Center. That's an example of how that should work. But the point is, there should be set goals for the board that inform the goals of the committee. Managing the agenda for the board meeting, that's another key way to make sure that the board stays in their lane. One of my favorite stories to share is when I was a new division head leader. One of the things I learned pretty quickly was, when we completed the agenda of the faculty meeting, do not at the end say, okay, does anyone else have anything? You think that's a great way to end the meeting, right? No, if you've completed the agenda, the things that you have thoughtfully planned to complete, then you're finished. If people have something, then they need to visit with you, and you as the board president need to talk about how does that potentially fit into a future agenda meeting. Managing the agenda is probably the best weapon for keeping the board in the lane. If you at the end say, okay, new business, anyone have anything, and open it up to basically open mic, you're opening the door for someone to bring forward a operational matter or an operational question through no bad intention of their own, but potentially something that may or may not be appropriate at that board meeting. So really be intentional about the agenda. Question whether or not there needs to be a space for new business. New business is frankly best handled between the board member and the board president, or whatever your process looks like. So you can have a conversation with the board member, flesh out what needs to be done on that, determine if it truly is a board issue as opposed to an operational issue. If it is a board issue, then figure out how to handle it in a future agenda. If it's an operational issue, it doesn't belong on the agenda at all, and facilitate that board member working through the issue with the appropriate staff member. Last item, manage the assessment process. So again, and we're gonna drill down on this in a little bit specifically with the head of school, but what about the board? The board should be participating in an annual assessment of itself as well. If you have set goals for the board, if you have articulated a expectation sheet or a behavioral expectation covenant, whatever you want to call that, then at the end of the year, the board president really should oversee a process whereby the board asks the question, how did we do this year? Are we living by the expectations that we've articulated? Did we accomplish the goals that we set at the beginning of the year? If we did, then great. If not, what do we need to tweak? You can't do that assessment process if you don't set those goals and set those expectations on the front end. Okay, let me stop there. I've been speaking a lot, so I want to stop there and see if there's any questions or if there's any points of clarification.
Well, we only have one question at this point, and it's and it may be addressed down the road, but is there one word of advice or action that comes to the top of the mind for success?
Specifically for the board president, the one thing I think that's most important is keeping the main thing the main thing. I think these three plays try to identify what I think are the most, the three most critical things. But if you made me pick one, I think that that's hard to pick just one. But I think if you're really focusing on keeping the board focused on that top lane, then if you'll do that, I think that is probably the best way to set yourself up for success. The flip side to that is I guarantee it's the best way to set yourself up for limited success is if you muck around in that bottom lane. Does that make sense? I think that is the ideal way to make sure you're not going to have a successful year is if you let the board get pulled into operational issues. So to me,
Right.
yeah, if I had to pick one, no one else can make sure the board is focusing on board type issues. So that would be the one I would pick if I had to pick one.
David, we have one other question about the secretary. This question is, I thought the secretary was responsible for onboarding new board members. Can you clarify what is the role of the president?
That's a great question. So it's absolutely possible that your bylaws say your bylaws assign that task to somebody. So on my board, for example, our vice president is in charge of what we would have a committee on trustees. So if that task has been assigned to an officer, then your job as president is to make sure that that officer is doing the best possible job that he or she can do. I think even if it's assigned to an officer to lead that, I think the board president needs to be involved in that as the leader, because you as the board president are going to set the tone of trust. And even though the secretary may be tasked with pulling that together, the board president is going to set the tone because they're leading the meetings. So short answer is double check your bylaws. And if your bylaws have delegated that task to an officer specifically, then that's fine. But don't feel as the board president that it's automatically being done well. I think you need to play a role in that. Do you have anything else to add to that, MK?
No, I agree with that. I think that I think it just depends on kind of what the school's role, what the school does. In our situation at St. Albans, it was the board chair and the head of school that did that. So I think it just kind of depends. We do have another question. What is the best strategy for helping chair and president to focus on education of board and themselves and on setting goals for the board and the head?
So did I hear right? This is a chair president setup.
Helping chair and president, yes.
And then tell me again the specific.
And kind of what is the best strategy for helping them focus on the education of the board and themselves and on setting goals for the board and the head?
Okay, so education of board and then goals for the head. So I'm going to hold goals for the head because we're going to talk about that in the second section of the presentation today. Education of the board, you can do that a couple of different ways. First and foremost, there needs to be professional development for all your board members, and that can take a variety of different forms. If you're an SAES school, then we offer up to 2 hours of live board training for no fee. The school's responsible for travel expenses, but that's something that we can do for you. If you'd rather look at written materials, then NAIS produces a trustee handbook and several books. They have a whole trustee kit that you may want to explore if you want to give your board members some reading material and approach it that way. These webinars are a great way for board members to become educated. I also will highlight a leadership and governance webinar that we do twice a year. It's a 3-hour session that can serve as your board training for your entire board. That's a great option for you. And then this year, our biennial conference will be in Houston in October. So that's a day and a half of professional development where we have different workshops for board members and school leaders. So those are some ideas on education options for your board. But first and foremost, make sure you're doing something every year. And I think it makes sense to do something Separate for your new board members, I'd like to do a separate onboarding session just for them, just so they understand, one, welcome, and two, they're going to have some questions that your returning board members may or may not have. But make sure you're doing something every year would be my first piece of advice. And then it's just a matter of finding great resources. Again, use us, use NAIS. There will be other local providers in your area that are not associated with us, but we know of other local providers if you want to bring someone else in. So just let us know. We'd be happy to help with that. Okay, let's go into the second section, because this is going to get into setting goals for the head of school as well as the evaluation process of the head of school. So here's a quote from BoardSource. BoardSource is a great resource of best practices relating to board leadership. They're not specifically from the Episcopalian perspective or specifically from the school perspective, but they are from the nonprofit world, and their materials are great. Here's how they describe the president-head relationship. Effective chairs or presidents embrace their role as a strategic partner and important resource to the executive or the head of school, and work to build a trusting relationship built on mutual respect. This is a quote from the NAIS Board Chair Handbook that I think really does a great job at framing things. The head should acknowledge the chair's perspective as the board leader, most responsible for ensuring the school's long-term viability. The chair must respect the head's work experience and remember that sustained leadership is essential for school success. So the board employs the head. So this means that in some ways, the president really steps into a role that feels like direct supervisor of the head. That's kind of how that role feels. Or if you're in a president-chair model, there's kind of two folks stepping in that role that feels like direct supervisor. It's not exactly that way, though. It's a little more nuanced than that. So if you're in a situation where you have employees reporting to you, this is a little bit different, because the head doesn't work for you. The head works for the board as an entity, but you as the leader of the board are in a unique role and a unique relationship with that head of school. So I think that does a good job of setting the guidelines for what that partnership looks like. And I would say first and foremost, the most important thing there is trust. When this relationship works and when it works well, both parties, or in a chair-president situation, all three parties have a high level of trust. And I would suggest that the board leadership establishes 3 specific guidelines to help build this trust and make this relationship work. First and foremost, the president's going to receive complaints. If you have not received complaints already as the board chair or the board president, give it time. You will. And I think first and foremost, there needs to be an agreement that when the president or the chair receives complaints about personnel or programs, or really anything in that operational lane, then the president will do 2 things: refer and notify. Refer the matter to the head of school or the appropriate staff member, and notify the head of school. So again, we can look at different cases. It may get referred to not the head, but someone on the head staff, but you need to notify the head so the head knows what the issue is. And that's it. Notify does not mean direct. Notify does not mean notify and give suggestions on how you think it should be resolved necessarily, unless that's requested. Notify is just that. Head of school, I received a complaint from parent X. I've referred parent X to the division head. Just wanted to let you know. And that's it. Now, the conversation may go a different direction once you've opened it, but that's basically where that stops.
Yeah, David, I'd like to just add to that.
Yeah.
I mean, this is as a former head of school, this is a critical support piece for the head of school, to know that your board chair is going to give you a heads up for things. And being blindsided there's nothing worse. And so it feels really important to I can't overstate the importance of the president talking to the head of school and saying, hey, this is what I'm hearing, and this is what was told to me, and letting the head of school handle it. but giving them the heads up. That's was really critical for me as a head of school.
And it doesn't take many times to not do that and erode trust.
Exactly.
If you really want to erode trust, surprise your head of school or let your head of school get blindsided about something that you knew that you didn't share. That is an ideal way to erode trust. So I think first and foremost, you just agree this is how we're going to handle complaints this year. The suggestion would be the president agrees to be a confidential sounding board. One of the gifts you can give the head of school is serve as a confidant and someone that can be a sounding board. Listen, here's what I'm thinking about. I'm exploring going this direction. What do you think? Head work is lonely work. And being able to trust that you can go to your board president or chair and say, hey, I'm thinking about doing A, B, or C. What do you think? And getting feedback, getting non-judgmental feedback, and getting confidential feedback. Absolutely critical. And if you will demonstrate that you're good at that, then it's a great way to build trust.
Right. One question, if a complaint is made to a board chair, do they identify the parent when informing the head? Is that something you want to do?
I'd love to learn a little bit more about that, but I tend to not deal with confidential matters. I'd love to hear your perspective on that from the boards, but I tend to think if someone brings something to me as a board president but wants to remain confidential, again, it would depend on the context, but I would tend to say, hey, I'm happy to, because of my role as board president, I need to share this information, and I'm going to share this information with where it originated. That's my thought. MK, what do you think about that? I mean, it's a little bit difficult because we're talking without factual context, and there could be certain things in the facts that would make me reverse that. But in general, I think that's how I'd respond to that.
Yeah, I don't feel good generally about when a parent says, I want to tell you this, but I don't want you to say who said it. Because the truth is, if you're going to solve a problem, you need to know the root of the problem. And so that goes back to the idea of the president being and the head having trust. Much of the time, a parent that complains like that is they're worried that their kid's going to get some sort of repercussion or whatever. And I think it's really important. I think it's important to be authentic and to address the situation at the root. And you can't do that if you don't know the whole context of the situation.
And again, I'm speaking in generalities without knowing a particular case or a particular fact pattern, but let's play that out a little bit. So a parent comes to me as the board president and says, I've got concerns about my teacher. I've got concerns about my child's teacher. But hey, I want to share this with you, but I don't want you to say something to the president. I don't want you to say something to the head. At that point, I think I would just encourage them to, hey, that's an operational matter. I know it's important to you. I know you're seeking for the best for your child. And my hope is that you will take that matter to the head of school and have that conversation with the head of school. I think that's where I would go with that personally. So.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think you can also, as a board president, say to the parent, encourage them that the head wants to solve problems and the
Correct.
head wants to be successful as well. And so that's kind of, sometimes we don't, the trust factor of the head needs to be encouraged by the board. You can say to a parent, hey, you can trust this head of school to do the right thing.
I'm very nervous about what it would do to the relationship between the head and the president if the president goes to the head and says, hey, I want to notify you that a parent talked to me about concerns about Mrs. Smith, and Mrs. Smith maybe is inexperienced, but I don't want to tell you what the name of that parent. No, I'm not going to tell you who. That to me, that's concerning on how does that build trust. So really good question. And this is why this job can be so difficult because, everyone is, for the most part, everyone is coming at this from really, really good motives. Their approach, their strategy may not be ideal, but as the board president, you're having to kind of walk through that landmine, that minefield, and avoid all those things. But I'd be concerned about you taking something to the board president, but well, I don't want to tell you where it originated. I think that could erode trust.
Here's a follow-up question to that. Is there value in offering to set up a meeting with the head of school and the parent and participate in that meeting?
But yeah, great question. So short answer, potentially. So let's talk about the pros and the cons of that. The pros of that is if you've got a parent who, for whatever reason, is nervous, if you do it that way, then you know that the head and the parent are going to be in a face-to-face conversation. That's the pro. The downside about that is, one, the old saying, if you feed one stray cat, you're going to feed a whole lot of stray cats. So the unspoken message could be that if you really want to get the heads of school's attention, you have to get the board president in the room with the head. And I don't know if that's healthy. I also don't know if it's healthy because the other unspoken message there is that if it's an operational matter, that the board president is somehow involved in an operational matter. And that's an inappropriate message to send, because if it's an operational matter, the final arbiter, the final decider is the head of school. So the board president's presence in that conversation is muddying the waters, because the board president's presence in that conversation is saying, it's an operational matter and I represent the board, and the board gets involved in operational matters. So that's a downside. So short answer, I think it probably, the negative, I think, outweighs the positive in that scenario. I think the best scenario is operational matter. Please see the head of school. Please see the head of school. Can I set a meeting up for you and not be present? But I'll tell you, that would be a guideline. If that's what it's going to take to get the parent and the president, the parent and the head of school in a room and having that conversation initiating, maybe. How's that for a nuanced answer? Finally, another guideline on how to build trust. In public, the president is the head's ambassador and cheerleader. That is not to say that in private, the president can't share critical feedback, and sometimes very, very direct critical feedback. That's appropriate, but in private. In public, the president's job is to be the ambassador for the head and to be the biggest cheerleader for the head. If you're in a situation where you cannot do that, then unfortunately you have to ask whether or not you're best equipped to be the head of school, to be the president of the board, or are you in a situation where the board needs to contemplate a leadership transition? I don't know. But if you are, for whatever reason, not able to be in public the head's biggest ambassador and the head's biggest cheerleader, that's a warning sign. Okay, let's talk about a start of the year checklist. So we're about to start the year. Some of our schools have started. I would recommend that every board president has this checklist to take a look at. And have we accomplished all of these things? Number one, develop a rough map of the board meetings and the topics to be explored. Now, we've talked about that a little bit, and it's going to be rough because you know what? The year is going to unfold, and you're going to be surprised, and you're going to have to move things around. That's fine. But have you basically sketched out, here are the 9 meetings or the 10 meetings we're having this month. Here are the topics we're going to explore at each of those meetings, in addition to the fiduciary matters that we have to handle at every meeting. 2, schedule meetings for the 2 leaders to discuss school issues and board operations. So I would say, this probably should be weekly, maybe not face-to-face necessarily, but there needs to be a weekly conversation, in my opinion. Now, MK, with your board president, was that a weekly check-in? Every head board president they do that a little differently. How frequently did you check in with your board president?
Well, for sure, on a monthly basis, we met monthly to discuss what was happening, getting ready for the board meeting, et cetera. Sometimes it depended upon who the board chair was. If it was a parent that showed up at the school almost on a daily basis, then yeah, we checked in pretty regular. I always try to keep the board chair informed of decisions that might come to them. So the opposite is true too. When when the board chair is keeping the head apprised of things they're hearing, the same was true for me. I tried to keep the board chair apprised of things that we might be doing that they might hear things about. So it was, seeing them on a daily basis, sometimes letting them know what was going on. For sure, a weekly conversation is important, I think, especially in the beginning.
It makes me nervous if at the start of the year there isn't some type of plan for how are we going to regularly check in, whether it's something as formal as every Friday we're going to have a cup of coffee when I drop my kids off, to a phone call, to something. What I would say is don't just assume those meetings are going to happen. At least have the conversation around, okay, how are we going to keep each other informed? How is the head going to keep the president informed of what's going on, and vice versa?
There was a question, sorry to interrupt, that about the head and the board chair. Does the head need to meet with both the head and the board chair if there's one of each? Or, I'm sorry, the head and the board chair, or the head and the president?
The president, yeah. And I think that goes back to the idea of how, if you're in a chair-president role, how that's divided up. So in some situations, the chair and the president may sit down and say, okay, for example, the chair in the Diocese of Texas by default is the rector. And so the rector as the chair and the board president as the elected leader of the board may sit down and decide, okay, board president, I'm going to meet with the head of school weekly, and we're going to notify you if we need to have more frequent conversations, but we're going to get together monthly. The board president, the board chair, and the head of school are going to get together once a month to kind of talk about how things are going. So, in an ideal world, yeah, maybe the board chair, the board president, and the head sit down once a week. I don't know how realistic that is, but the teaching point is that needs to be coordinated between the chair and the president, and however they decide to do that's up to them. Develop a set of annual goals for the head. So in an ideal world, before the first board meeting, the board leadership, president or chair, and the head have sat down and developed their goals, and have got those ready to present to the board for some feedback and then adoption. In the same way, have goals been set for the board and the committees, as I discussed earlier? And then is there a plan for PD for the board as well? So I want to ask a poll question really quick. So if that's your checklist, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things done. As of today, tell me how y'all are doing. Do you have all those done, ready to launch? Maybe you've got half of them done, 2 or 3, maybe 1, maybe 2. Or that's a great list, David. That's the first time I've seen a list like that. We've got some work to do. Where would you put yourself on that spectrum? We'll kind of see how we're doing. And answers are coming in. Okay, we'll open it up for another 5 seconds or so. Okay, let's see how we're doing here. So yeah, a little bit all over the map, which honestly, that's exactly where I would expect you to be. Some of y'all, still have a couple weeks. Some of y'all have started. So yeah, we've got, a good 62% of y'all have either knocked all of them out or maybe have done some of them. And then a handful of folks have identified, you know what, yeah, that's a good list. We've got to talk about that. So yeah, that's about where I would expect you to be. So the action item for you is, if you are in the all of them, we're ready to launch category, then you can cross that off. If you're in either the maybe half or the 1 or 2 items completed, figure out what you can get done, pretty soon. And then if we have some work to do, pick 1 or 2. If it's something where you haven't gone through this type of checklist before, then pick 1 or 2. If I had to pick 1 or 2, I think I would start with goals. MK, where would you, if you had to pick 1, where would you go to? I mean, all these they're good. The agenda piece is good. If you were going to pick 1 though, where would you go?
I would say the goals. Yeah, I think the goals are the critical component.
I think without that, then it's going to be very difficult to do any kind of board assessment or any head assessment. So that would be where I would probably go if you made me pick one.
So we did
Okay.
have a question about that real quick. Would any of these be handled at the board retreat?
Yeah, so I think ideally, yeah, I think the board retreat's an awesome place to frankly do all of this. Now that assumes that you've done some lead work, and depending on when you do your board retreat, you may or may not be ready to roll all of this out. But let's say you do your board retreat middle of August, kind of as people start coming back. Ideally, before that board retreat, the president and the head have sat down, sketched out the agenda for the year, sketched out, okay, we're going to touch base every, Friday when I drop the kids off. You've talked about your annual goals. I did that with my board president, for example, in end of July, early August, and then have just sent those out to my board for their feedback, and we'll adopt those at our next board meeting. Same with goals for the board. And then in an ideal world, you probably have a PD element at your board retreat. So that takes a little, if you want to bring someone in, that takes some advanced planning. But your plan may be, okay, later on this year, we're going to bring someone in to talk to us about hallmarks of a high-performing board. So yeah, in an ideal world, I think you have all of that sketched out, and the board retreat is when you adopt the goals for the head, adopt the goals for the board, do a little PD, talk about the agenda, et cetera, et cetera.
David, when you talk about PD, you're talking about professional development for the board, correct?
Thank you. Yes, PD is professional development for the board. So some of the topics we talked about earlier, either NAIS written material, our webinars, live training, whatever that looks like, but there needs to be some type of professional development every year for the board, correct? Okay, let's go into the head of school evaluation and setting goals, because this is a topic, this was something that y'all highlighted when we started this morning, or this afternoon rather, and this is also a topic that I get tons of questions on. So let's take a look at this. I'm always a little bit nervous when I get a call in April or May from a board president that says, hey, we probably need to do a board head of school evaluation. Can you send me the form? Send me a form. No one around here has the paperwork. No one around here has the checklist. Send me the form. I'm always a little bit nervous. I don't push back too much because at that point, I'm always happy to hear from a board president. But what concerns me about that is this should be a process. This should be a year-round process that doesn't just, quote, start, unquote, in April or May when we realize, oh gosh, we've got to do a head of school evaluation. So the first question I ask is, when was the last time you did your annual review of your head of school? Because lots of times the reason they can't find the quote form, unquote, is because we haven't done one in a few years. So first and foremost, this is a process that needs to be ongoing, and there needs to be a formal review of your head of school every single year. Second, there has to be an understanding on the criteria for what the evaluation process looks like before the year begins. And there's nothing more frustrating to a head of school than being evaluated on a mysterious or unknown list of criteria. So what that understanding should include would be mutually acceptable annual goals. So if we go back to the previous slide in that checklist, we've done that. We before the annual retreat, we had a conversation. We identified here are the 2 or 3 things that we want you to focus on as your annual goals. We're going to have a measure to assess your goal attainment, some way to ascertain that you knocked it out of the park, or you got close, or maybe there are some extenuating circumstances we didn't expect, but something along those lines. And then there needs to be appropriate involvement of the full board. Now, normally that's accomplished through a survey instrument. So there's a survey instrument of some type that y'all have developed that gives every board member the opportunity to share feedback on how we feel the head of school did this year. Now, I like the idea of a head support and evaluation committee. So normally what happens is this task can sometimes just fall on the president's shoulder, and I would say push back against that a little bit and explore using a head support and evaluation committee. Now, we don't have time to drill down into all the nuts and bolts of that, but let me just give you a thumbnail sketch of what that looks like. that's the committee that would basically oversee this process. So obviously the president's going to chair it, maybe 2 or 3 other board members, and identify what those goals are, identify that we're going to have maybe 3 or 4 check-ins a year where that committee gets together with the head of school and checks in on how things are doing. That committee then administers the survey to all of the board members, collates all that data, and puts it together in a shareable document that the committee will use to discuss with the head of school. And then that document goes to the entire board for the entire board to have a conversation in executive session with the head of school about how they did this year. Okay, that's a thumbnail sketch of what a head support and evaluation committee looks like. We're going to offer a webinar down the road that drills down to that a little bit more. But if there's not a head support and evaluation committee that oversees this process, you may want to explore that. But at the core, it's a process. Please view this as something that happens throughout the entire year and not just something that happens in April or in May at the end of the year. And it needs to involve goal development. It needs to involve regular check-ins with the head of school. And then also the head of school should be allowed to provide some type of narrative reflection on how she feels that she did or he did throughout the year as well. Okay, let's move into the last section before we open it up. So if you are a new board president or chair, then there are 2 specific questions that I want you to ask before this week is up. Number 1, strategic planning. When was the last strategic plan approved? If no one can exactly remember, or if it's more than 3 years, then it may be time to explore a new strategic plan. That is another purely board function that falls upon the board chair's shoulders to make sure that we're doing. If you are a new board chair and they just did a strategic plan last year, then fantastic. But if no one can remember when the last strategic plan was, or if it was more than 3 or 4 years ago, then that may be one of your goals as the board chair this year, and for the board to explore time to embark on a new strategic planning process. Second question, accreditation. What's our accreditation status? And specifically, when was the last on-site visit? Your last on-site visit, if you're an accredited school, yielded a on-site visit report that is chock full of observations, commendations, and recommendations that will give the board a good feel for how is the school functioning in connection with accreditation standards. The other reason to know that is that there is an interim report that is due midway through that 10-year cycle. And then if you're at the end of your 10-year cycle, it may be pretty close to self-study year or on-site visit year. Now, again, we don't need to go into the nuts and bolts of what that all means. We've got lots of webinars on those topics. But as a board president, you should be able to say, when was our last accreditation visit? Here are the major recommendations that were made during that last accreditation visit, and we have either crossed them all off or we are in the process of crossing them off. If you're a new board president, ask those questions this week. If you're a returning board president and you can't answer those questions, then get with your head of school and get a good understanding on where the school is vis-a-vis its accreditation. Okay, let me stop there. And now we've got some time just to share. So if there are any questions on any topics or follow-ups or need a little more information, let's spend a little bit of time on those kinds of issues right now. So MK, how is the Q&A box looking?
Okay, so David, we've got one question just real quickly from that last slide is who heads up the accreditation task? Is it the board chair or the head of school?
So it's a shared responsibility, but really if the board, the head of school really is going to be responsible for that. Now within the accreditation process, the board has some certain defined roles. So for example, one of the self-study chapters is governance. So obviously the board will be involved in articulating the governance structure, talking about areas of improvement, talking about strengths. But I view the accreditation process really, that's operational.
One question, what are some ideas for changing or improving board culture to create a more positive board?
Great question. Again, I think I would highlight some of the things we talked about with regard to first see if there are warning signs. That's the first thing. So the first thing is take a look at that slide on warning signs. Are you seeing, assess your culture basically is what I'm saying. Are people sharing freely at meetings? Are there meetings after the meetings? Are there some personalities that are dominating the conversation such that others can't participate in? Once you've assessed along those lines, if there are problems, I think that will tell you what you need to do. So, for example, if you think that one board member is dominating the conversations too much, then you may have to pull that person aside privately at first and say, you know what, thank you, but you sometimes I want to make sure other people have a chance. So in the future, I may start calling on other people. I may thank you and then call on someone else. Please don't read into that, but I want to make sure that everyone around the board table can talk. That's one example. If there are meetings after the meetings, then that tells me there's a trust issue. So normally that means that someone wants to say something, but for whatever reason, be it a positive motivation or a negative motivation, they're not saying it they're not saying it out loud at the board meeting. So if that's the issue, you drill down on that with the folks who are having the meeting after the meeting and trying to get a feel for why do we have a 2-hour meeting and then I see another 25-minute meeting taking place in the parking lot, and drill down on that. What are some of your thoughts, MK, on another kind of building a positive board culture?
Yeah, one thing we haven't really touched on, I think, is a great idea is to begin the year, socially doing something together as a group, maybe even with spouses, just to get to know each other. I think building trust, that's a critical component of building trust, is knowing each other and kind of, so maybe doing some social things together is good. There is another question about, and it's not really about that, but strategies for informing the broader parent community about the function of the board.
Yeah, and so this is something that I am starting to hit more on in my live training, particularly with current board parents. Here's the challenge with that. It's great that we as board members go through this training and understand the complexity of those lanes, but that's only half the challenge. If we're not communicating that and educating our parent population on that, then we're not closing the loop. So what I've recommended boards consider is start doing some parent education specifically on the role of the board. Drilling down even further, the board does not get involved in operational issues. We are here to be involved in strategic and generative decision-making and thinking for the school. Operational issues are handled by the head of school. So maybe the board president does a brief write-up in either the monthly newsletter or whatever the communication method, maybe it's a e-newsletter or a school magazine, but just does a write-up to the parents on, hey, I'm the new board president or I'm the returning board president. We had a great training session on the role of the board. I just wanted to share with you that we were reminded that the board is best served by focusing on generative issues and strategic issues. And so that's really what we're focusing on this year, and we're looking forward to that. And operational matters are handled best by our awesome head of school. So if you bring certain things to individual board members, please don't be surprised if they say, you know what, that's a great question. Please go visit the head of school. I think if we aren't doing that, then we're doing a disservice to our current parent board members. I think we're kind of leaving them out unprotected if we're not educating the entire parent population on that.
Right. Okay, so a couple of things. I know we're running short on time, but so if we have the treasurer, a question about last webinar, the treasurer webinar, can we get a copy of that webinar? And yes, it's on the SAES website. Is that recorded webinar for the treasurer, role of the treasurer on the SAES website right now?
It should be. If it's not, okay. So sometimes it takes a little bit of time for us to move it from where they live now to the website. If you go to the website under webinar library, it should be
Correct.
there. If it's not, just email me and we can
Right.
send you the link.
Right. And also, we've got one other person, and I think I'm going to refer them to give you a call. It's about not just needing additional training beyond this and this other recorded webinars. And so we'll have you call them or have them call the SAS office about other webinars or slide decks that we've done in the past on board training.
Yeah, and or absolutely. And so take a look at the webinars that are coming up, but also drop me an email, because if there's some specific topics that you're looking at, we may have some other suggestions as well. So if you're thinking through needing professional development specifically on a topic, yeah, fire me an email and we'll come up with some resources for you. That's easy.
Great. I think that's it. I think any other questions that we have, if you want to stick them in the Q&A box.
And we're going to hang around for a little bit, but I want to respect everyone's time, so I do want to go ahead and adjourn our session. We're not running away. Please feel free to stay if you have some other questions. But Mary Catherine, thank you for your time today.
You bet. I'm sorry about all the commotion back here.
No worries. And participants, thank you all so much. We're going to hang around for a little bit for some additional questions, but otherwise, we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar.